After losing the first game of the season against Pittsburgh, the Louisville Cardinals bounced back in a major way with an absolutely dominant 23-0 victory over the 20th ranked Duke Blue Devils. We're going to discuss that result in its entirety on today's episode of the Locked On Louisville podcast. Stay tuned.
You are Locked On Louisville, your daily podcast on the Louisville Cardinals. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
What is going on, everyone? Welcome into another episode of the Locked On Louisville podcast. I'm your host, Dalton Pence. Today's episode brought to you by PrizePicks. Go to prizepicks.com/lockedoncollege and use the code LOCKEDONCollege for a first deposit match up to $100. Daily fantasy sports made easy. As always, I want to take this time to personally thank you all for making us your first listen of the day. Just a reminder that the Locked On Louisville podcast is free on all streaming services, 5 days a week, your team every day. As I mentioned, what a way to bounce back. The Louisville Cardinals, after losing a couple weeks ago to Pittsburgh, first loss of the season, they went into the bye week with some questions that need to be answered. One of the main ones was, how was Louisville going to respond to that first loss? And they did so in a major way. 23-0 victory over Duke. We're going to discuss that matchup, that result. We'll also talk about Jawhar Jordan's career day on the ground and the defense balling out against Riley Leonard and Mike Elko's offense. So, like I said, what a way to bounce back. There were some questions coming into this game as to how Louisville was going to respond to the loss against Pittsburgh. They had 2 weeks to prepare for a pretty solid Duke team, and it was obvious that Jeff Brohm and company did not waste any of that time. Louisville was seemingly dominant from the beginning until the end. Duke never really threatened in this game. This is the Cardinals' first victory, first shutout victory over a ranked team in program history. The lowest amount of points given up to a ranked team before this was the 2006 game against Miami, in which the Cardinals won 31-7. Ultimately, I had some questions coming into this matchup. If you've listened to the show the past couple of episodes, you know that I gave Duke their credit. Even when the offense wasn't necessarily doing a ton of great stuff, when Riley Leonard has been battling that ankle injury, when he missed the game against NC State, the defense still bailed them out. They played good enough to where the offense didn't have to do all that much to win games. 4 of the games that Duke has played this season prior to Louisville, they only allowed 7 points or under 7 points. 3 were 7 points, and I think they held a team to 3 points. But some of those were non-Power 5 teams, but some of them were. So Duke did a pretty solid job against Notre Dame. If they didn't give up that 4th and 16, well, they would have handed Notre Dame another loss. Riley Leonard, before going down, you can say that he wasn't playing all that great against Florida State. They were still leading against the Seminoles before he got injured. Granted, he goes down and Florida State ends up winning by 18, but that's neither here nor there. Coming into this matchup, I was a little bit worried about the Duke defense. Very, very good up front in the front 7. They do a good job of getting after the quarterback. Offensively, not necessarily a great passing team, but still respectable rushing the football. Riley Leonard, even though he was battling that ankle injury that he re-aggravated against Florida State, I still thought that, the Duke offense was going to be respectable coming into this game. Credit to Jeff Brohm, Brian Brohm, Ron English, Mark Hagan, and the rest of the coaching staff for putting a very solid game plan out there. I thought it was as close to a complete performance as we've seen this season. Most definitely, in my opinion, the best overall performance that we've seen. And just overall, I mean, you can say what you will about the offense only scoring 6 points in the final 2 quarters. I still think that, the offense did what it needed to do up until the end of the game, to where it was, seemingly that Louisville was just trying to run the clock out. But at that point, you're in a very, very solid position, a luxury, if you will, to be in that spot, to be leading by over 2 touchdowns and, just trying to run the clock out. I thought that offensively speaking, we saw something that we've continued to see, is that Jeff Brohm and company. Here's the thing for me. Coming into the season, all of the talk was about, air raid offense. They're going to throw the ball all over the field. It's going to be extremely exciting. And the more and more I went back and I studied Purdue's offense, the more and more I thought that Louisville fans were sort of getting or being misled a little bit in that thought. Now, I'm not saying that he doesn't open the playbook up and throw the ball over the field. I'm not saying that. I think my take on that is that Jeff Brohm goes with what is working, and he builds his offensive philosophy around the personnel on the offense and defense as well. And that's what great coaches do. I think each year it might be different, right? But this season, you understand that you have a great offensive line. You have 3 very capable potential feature running backs in this running back room, led by one of the most electric running backs in the country in Jawhar Jordan. We'll talk about him in the second segment, but I am very, very encouraged by, Brohm's commitment to doing or to running the offense in terms of what's working, going back to what's working and not shying away from that. If running the football is working, Brohm's going to continue to do that. We've seen that time and time again this season. And when it's not working, he's shown that, okay, we're going to throw the ball a little bit more. And if throwing the ball works more than running this game, well, we're going to throw the ball more. And I think that it's key to think about when you look at this 23-0 victory. There could be some complaints, and I've seen them that, Louisville's offense was pedestrian in the second half. I mean, sure, 6 points, I guess you could view that as being pedestrian, but let's also call it how it is. The Cardinals had the ball inside of Duke's 20-yard line multiple times in that second half. So looking at the drives in the second half, Louisville had a 14-play, 72-yard drive to open up the third quarter. You also have to look at the timing aspect. They took half of the clock off of the third quarter in that first drive. It was a field goal. Duke ends up throwing the interception. Louisville can't capitalize, but they end up hitting another field goal in the first 2 drives. So at that point, the Cardinals don't get the ball back until about a minute to go in the third quarter. Granted, you had 3 drives after that all ended in punts, 2 of those being 3-and-outs. It seemed like at that time that Louisville was just honestly trying to take some clock out, especially in the pass. In the last 2 drives, I should say, there was a situation to where, Duke got off the field at the end of the third quarter and forced Louisville to punt. Don't forget, this is still a very, very solid Duke defense. So, I mean, it is what it is. Louisville scored on 3 of the 5 offensive drives in the first half. 1 of the 5 was them kneeling the ball at the end of the first half. So 3 of the 4 were drives that ended up in points. So you look at the pace of the game, not that many drives throughout the game. Ultimately, I mean, you can say what you will about the pedestrian second half, but at the end of the day, it is what it is. Honestly, there are people that are saying that they don't necessarily agree with Brohm taking the points in the second half. I disagree there. I guess really it's all hindsight at the time, but I think both times when Louisville lined up for the field goal, I was fine with the Cardinals taking points. Of course, you want to get into the end zone, extend the lead even more. But at the end of the day, Duke was struggling to move the football and continually adding points onto that total and getting it to where, you add 6 points and, you make it a 3-possession game. I agree with that decision. I'm not necessarily saying that if Louisville doesn't get those touchdowns, if they go for it on 4th down and they don't get either one, it's still 17-0. It's still a 3-possession game that Duke is even able to come back. But I still, I like that security blanket. It would be different if Duke's offense was just moving the ball at will and Louisville was just struggling to, put a stop to Mike Elko's offense. But that wasn't the case. So I was fine with the offense doing what they needed to do and taking the points. Now, defensively speaking, it seemed like everything went right for the Cardinals defense on Saturday. And we're going to talk about that here in the third segment a little bit further. But before we stop talking offense, let's talk about the main storyline on the offensive side of the ball. That was Jawhar Jordan's career day. We will discuss that here momentarily after we talk about our friends over at Athletic Brewing. If you go to athleticbrewing.com, you can see all of the game-changing non-alcoholic brews in the industry right now. Both of the stores are in Milford, Connecticut or San Diego, California, but being in Louisville, tough to get that. Look no further. Go to athleticbrewing.com to find all of their over 50 styles of non-alcoholic beers, from crafts, IPAs, golden, sours. This time of year, my favorite is the Oktoberfest. It is the best flavor for me. You don't get that hangover, and it's fit for all times. Whether you're working out, whether you are watching a ball game, working on a project or a presentation for work, it's extremely versatile. Go to athleticbrewing.com, enter the code LOCKEDON to get 15% off your first online order. Once again, go to athleticbrewing.com and enter the code LOCKEDON to get 15% off your first online order. Also want to take this time to tell you about our friends over at eBay Motors. Passion, drive, and patience. What brings home the winning trophy is also what keeps your ride or die alive. eBay Motors has everything you need to maintain your vehicle and level it up to peak performance, from superchargers, roof racks, exhaust kits, LED headlights, and more. Whether you're into speed, power, or style, eBay Motors has got you covered. With over 122 million parts for your number one ride or die, you'll always find exactly what you're looking for. And with eBay Guaranteed Fit, your part is guaranteed to fit your ride every time, or you get your money back. Because with eBay Motors, you're burning rubber, not cash. With all the parts you need at the prices you want, it's easier to turn your car into the MVP and bring home that win. Keep your ride or die alive at ebaymotors.com. Eligible items only. Exclusions apply. eBay Guaranteed Fit only available to U.S. customers. Hey, Cardinal fans, thanks again for making Locked On Louisville your first listen of the day. As the season continues to go along, don't forget that Locked On continues to kick up our coverage with Locked On College Football Kickoff Live. Each Friday, Locked On will go live at 11 a.m. Eastern on every Locked On College YouTube channel. College Football Kickoff Live will cover playoff implications, the conference rivalry games, while also going in-depth like only Locked On can, including insight and analysis from our stable of Locked On College hosts covering their team every day. Find the Locked On College Football Kickoff Live every Friday at 11 a.m. Eastern Time on any Locked On College YouTube channel. You won't want to miss it, so be sure to stay tuned. As I mentioned before we went to break, Jawhar Jordan had a career day against Duke. Now, granted, it seems like he has a career day more often than not when he steps foot on the field for Louisville this season. But statistically speaking, he had a career high in rushing yards against a very stout Duke defense, had 163 yards, 2 touchdowns to go along with that. Absolutely phenomenal in his performance against Duke. Averaged 7.8 yards per carry. Now, this is a Duke team that had not allowed over 215 rushing yards in any game this season. Louisville, obviously, is the exception now, rushing for over 234 yards. And that is also, factoring in the sack yardage as well that the Duke defense accumulated. So the numbers are probably even a little higher than 234. But nonetheless, still speaking, a lot of that was because of Jawhar Jordan. What makes this even more impressive is that Brohm said after the game, hey, look, we didn't know how healthy Jordan was going to be in this game. He saw minimal action against Pittsburgh a couple weeks, had 2 carries for 8 yards, I believe, was nursing a hamstring issue, went into bye week, which was critical for Louisville, didn't really practice the week prior, didn't practice much this week either, and was seemingly a game time decision. I know that he put on social media that he was going to be ready to go, and that he was. Jordan didn't seem to have any it didn't have anything holding him back in this game, and he continually showed why he is one of the most dynamic running backs in the ACC. Not only that, but also the whole country. The narrative early on that I saw from some people in the national landscape, not necessarily in the media, but just other fans on social media, Twitter to be specific, was that the narrative was that Jordan is decent, but he's only doing this against subpar opposition. And then he goes out and he doesn't have the greatest game against NC State, 16 carries for 32 yards. And people start to think, well, maybe those narratives are really holding true. And I'm like, well, let's pump the brakes a little bit. Credit to NC State for plugging the gaps in the Louisville offensive line. The offensive line didn't necessarily create a ton of room for him to run through. And then the Cardinals play against Notre Dame. He has a phenomenal game against the Irish, scores a couple of touchdowns, and then Pittsburgh obviously struggles because he only had 2 carries. And then you look at the matchup against Duke, and he has an absolute career day. It's pretty insane to watch his ability to stop and change direction so quickly. And also, getting through the line of scrimmage, seeing him absolutely burst through that first line of the defense. It's like seeing someone getting shot out of a cannon, just running up through that line of defense. And that just goes to show you with his 2 touchdown runs is that if you give him any amount of daylight, it has a very real possibility to turn into a house call for Jawhar Jordan. He has been absolutely phenomenal. 10 rushing touchdowns on the season. It's like people continually look for him to hit that wall to where he starts to regress a little bit. And granted, he's not averaging over 10 yards a carry anymore, which that's pretty unrealistic playing Power 5 football. But it hasn't regressed that much. He's still averaging 7.5 yards per carry. That's factoring in the game where he only averaged 2 yards per carry against NC State and then 4 yards per carry against Pittsburgh on 2 carries. The fact of the matter is, each game this season, outside of those 2 performances, he has not rushed for under 6 yards per carry. It's very, very clear to me. There were some fans before the season talking about how, I think Jordan could be a nice, solid change of pace back. No, he is a feature back. He is a RB1 if there ever has been one. You can say what you want about him being more of a speed back than a power back, but I think that he has an underrated, strength there as well to be able to shed that first line of defense and be able to get into the second level. Ultimately, my prediction of him rushing for over 1,000 yards, that literally I think I repeated and regurgitated probably 50 times before the first game against Georgia Tech, seemingly at this point looks like it's going to come true with 4 games left on the schedule. Virginia Tech, Virginia, Miami, and Kentucky. Jordan is currently at 824 yards on 110 carries. He's been extremely efficient here. I think that this season is going to start turning heads in the NFL realm when it comes to scouting Jawhar Jordan. I have always been under the assumption that this is going to be his last season. Now, granted, do I know that? Not necessarily. Although I think he has another year, if I'm not mistaken. I honestly would have to go back and look at that. I think he does have another season that he could utilize if he wanted to, but I'm not necessarily so sure that he's going to need to. Now, granted, he could, decide to show NFL scouts next year that, hey, look, I can do it again. But with the season that he's having, I think he's already showing enough scouts that, hey, look, you prioritize speed in the NFL in today's realm. Well, I've got a ton of it, and I have a whole season of highlights to prove it. I just think that overall this is going to be one of the special seasons in program history that we're going to look back on and really be appreciative of what we're getting from him this season. Probably one of the best running back opportunities or running back performances from a season-long standpoint in quite some time. Now, Louisville has been pretty blessed with some great running backs in program history, especially over the past 20 years. I definitely would not recommend overlooking what Jordan is doing this season, because Jaws is having quietly a stellar season to go along with what this Louisville offense is doing. So I now want to take this time to transition over to the defensive side of the ball. The defense absolutely balled out against Duke, and we're going to discuss that here momentarily after we talk about our friends and the title sponsor of the show, PrizePicks. PrizePicks is the largest independently owned daily fantasy sports platform in North America. We're the easiest and most exciting way to play DFS. It's literally just you against the numbers. Instead of battling thousands of players, including pros and sharks, you can pick more than or less than on 2 to 6 player stat projections. For me, the main things, quick withdrawals, easy gameplay, and an enormous selection of players and stat types are what makes PrizePicks the #1 daily fantasy sports app. It's the most fun you can have this season, winning up to 25 times your money on football. You just select 2 or more players, pick more than or less than on their projected stats, and place the entry. Go to prizepicks.com/LockedOnCollege and use the code LockedOnCollege for a first deposit match up to $100. Once again, prizepicks.com/LockedOnCollege while using the code LockedOnCollege for a first deposit match up to $100. All right, final segment of this reaction podcast episode of Locked On Louisville, discussing the 23-0 victory over Duke. Look, simply put, once again, the defense absolutely balled out. Now, granted, the turnover numbers might not necessarily be as glamorous as they were against Notre Dame, but I would argue that this was the most consistent performance. Duke could not move the ball on Louisville all game. I apologize. 9 first downs, 202 total yards. Now, granted, look, I know that Riley Leonard was not at full strength. He re-aggravated that ankle injury against Florida State, didn't reappear in that matchup against the Seminoles, was a game-time decision. I always said, look, I think that he's going to play. I'm not sure that he's going to be at full health. Now, granted, he wasn't. He was limping noticeably in that game last night against the Cardinals. But even then, Louisville really made it a point of emphasis to get into the opposing backfield. Duke also very solid at rushing the football. They had 21 carries for 51 yards. So Jordan Waters, who was the leader of the rushing attack, has 9 touchdowns on the season coming into the game. He had 5 for 23. Jacquez Moore had 6 for 15. Now, granted, I think one thing for me was Louisville's offense needed to get going early, because if you force Duke to have to throw the football, I think you put your defense in a very opportunistic situation, because Duke's MO on offense is, setting the tone on the ground and then basing everything that way. Making them one-dimensional was the key for me. That was the key of the game when we talked about it in the Grant Mulligan episode, and Louisville did just that. You forced Duke to throw the football, and Riley Leonard struggled. 9 of 23 for 121 yards. He had an interception as well. And then Grayson Loftus came in 3 of 5 for 30 yards. But nonetheless, it was absolutely outstanding performance for this Cardinals defense. Now, granted, we also need to talk about Louisville not turning the ball over, but Louisville winning the turnover margin was pretty huge. Overall, the Cardinals had 4 sacks, 6 tackles for loss. Ashton Gelati continually has balled out with each and every game. He is currently averaging at least 1 sack per game, which is phenomenal. TJ Quinn, Antonio Watts, Ashton Gelati, Jermaine Lole, Jeff Clark, Gilbert Frierson all had tackles for loss. Frierson had the interception. I liked to see Jermaine Lole and Jared Dawson healthy and playing for Louisville. I thought that they had pretty underrated performances against Duke. So overall, it's just another performance in a string of performances this season from the defense that has been very, very good. And that was one of the main question marks coming into the season, was how good is this Ron English defense going to be? The answer is really pretty solid. So this, like I said, the first time the Cardinals have shut out a ranked opponent in program history. The last time they even got close was 7 points against Miami back in 2006. That's the last time they allowed single digits. The only time before this that they allowed single digits to a ranked team. Overall, definitely a great performance to build upon. I think that you have to factor some of Riley Leonard's health into this one, but Leonard, even at 60%, 70%, or wherever he was at, not giving up a single point is huge. I mean, Duke absolutely just really couldn't get the ball into Louisville territory, and when they did, it stalled out. They had to punt. They just essentially could not move the ball. You look at their drives. They had 3 and out, punt. They had 6 plays, 24 yards, punt. 3 and out, punt. A 44-yard drive, which ended in a punt. That was probably the best drive of the game, but they did have to punt. 3 and out at the end of the first half. Interception to start the second half. 3 and out, punt. 3 and out, punt. 29-yard drive, had to punt. Turnover on downs in the final drive of the game. So overall, absolutely dominant from this Louisville defense. Absolutely dominant performance overall. And we're going to continue to break down this performance a little bit more analytically here in the next couple of episodes. But that's going to wrap up today's episode of the show. To find the podcast on all streaming services, be sure to stay tuned to this graphic. Locked On Louisville is free and available wherever you get your podcast.